So we've got Italian cypress and Leyland cypress, and those trees get canker diseases for different reasons. So we're going to start with Leylands. Leylands are water-loving trees.
Native to the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, and here we are in Texas, and you know, I think a lot of people have realized that it's not a good landscape tree. Now they are beautiful trees when they're healthy, they look great. But what I've been noticing with them is when they get drought stressed, that's when seiridium canker flares up. And actually at my HOA, I noticed a section, shame on me, I didn't say anything, but I noticed things, you know, we're tree guys.
Sure.
And so I noticed things. I noticed a section of the HOA, it looked like the irrigation was broke because I saw some of the signaling plants showing drought stress first. Mm-hmm. And I didn't say anything. But what ended up happening, the Leylands that were in that same area, I saw them start to fade, which is a symptom, or flag is another symptom. So flagging is when you have one dead branch kind of scattered through the canopy.
Right.
So they started to flag. And then within, I'd say this was over the course of a month. I think it was in July a few years ago. Over the course of the month, those trees died completely because that irrigation was broke. The seiridium canker flared up and it just took over the whole tree very, very quickly. And so with Leylands, it is a drought problem, which is kind of the opposite of what we've been talking about with these other tree pathogens where we've been saying, hey, cut the watering, cut the watering. With Leylands, you actually need to
increase
the watering because they want more water. And then with Italian cypress, it's the opposite. Italian cypress are native to Italy, which is rocky and arid. Mm-hmm. And so here we are in Dallas where we have clay soils that are not as well drained. And then
double the annual rainfall to where they're native.
And then you've got the bedding, the annuals and the azaleas and the hydrangeas and the irrigation problems that we were talking about earlier. And so with Italian cypress, it's the opposite problem.
Right.
They need to be not only planted in the right area, that's what I see a lot of times is they're planted up next to a house by the wall or next to a pool along the fence for screening. And again, these are beautiful trees when they're healthy, but they plant them in these areas and they landscape underneath them and they water them. And then all of a sudden you get these cankers and it turns into a very ugly tree.
Or you get the downspout discharging right at the base of the Italian cypress.
Yeah.
Next thing you know, it goes up in flames.
Those two things are super common, but also challenging to fix.
Yeah, we don't really have a great chemical control for that disease. It's a shotgun approach.
Yeah.
A lot of times the flares are buried on these trees. You know, they're dropping organic matter constantly out of the canopy and it accumulates under there and it has to be cleaned out, or they're buried too deep from being planted too deep or mulched too high. And you get all of these layers of stress start to pile up on them. I find that they generally come from the nursery looking fantastic, but in the nursery, all of the inputs can be controlled and you can create a perfect environment for a tree.
That's why it's called a nursery.
That's right. They're in the business of selling good looking plants and they're good at it. Well, you take it out and you put it in a landscape and now all of a sudden you can't control all those inputs and factors. And so they maintain that health for a while, but they start to lose that momentum after a few years in the landscape. And that's when you start to see them decline and become more and more susceptible.
Yeah,
and the best looking Italian cypress I see are the ones that are in unirrigated areas.
Like a cemetery?
Or a cemetery, they do good. And I've told customers from years ago, just cut the water off. And then I drive by later and they still look pretty good until we have one of these wet years. Mm-hmm. And then they struggle for a while.
So on the Italian cypress, what do you think? So like the freeze in 21, and then we had a pretty cold snap this winter as well. How do you think that impacted them negatively?
So I think that they're being a Mediterranean species, they also can be a little sensitive to some cold. And not that it will kill them outright just because it gets cold, but I think it can cause these little injuries, little small injuries. And then you have wet soils in the spring and that can create some stress. And I think that allows that pathogen to get a foothold in there and it accelerates the development of the disease on the species.
Okay.
And one of the worst years I remember was 2016 because we had a very, very wet year as we discussed earlier. I think it was actually our wettest year on record. And we had over 60 inches of precipitation. And so the trees were already stressed. The Italian cypress, we had a warm fall. It stayed warm, and then all of a sudden the temperature dropped off sharply in early December. And so there wasn't a hardening off period. And that created more wounds on these trees. But nothing happened yet. It was like lighting the fuse on a bomb.
Okay.
And that fuse went on until it started to warm up in late February, and then the bomb went off. And I got calls for Italian cypress every day for nearly 6 months.
Yeah.
And it was like an epidemic of seiridium cankers. And I think it was just a perfect storm scenario for that species. And it's almost like it just never really recovered fully in our area.
Yeah, a lot of them were removed from the landscape that year, for sure. And then on the Leyland cypress, those, I don't know, so that's always been an issue that I've seen with the seiridium canker, but it seems like right now driving around, I see an awful lot of Leylands that are looking really poor.
Absolutely, and I've observed the same thing as you. It's a water-loving species. It's native in the Pacific Northwest, and it doesn't fare as well when we have real brutal Texas summers. And last year was pretty rough.
Yeah, it was.
So I think we're going to see a lot of symptoms on those.
Yeah,
this year.
And the consideration on that is as those trees get larger in size, their demands for water increase as well.
Absolutely.
And so I've talked, something I've been playing around with again is the growth regulator. One of the other side effects of that treatment is it does enhance fibrous root development. And so again, we're blocking that growth pathway. The tree has to redirect its energy, and one of those places is fibrous root development. And it also helps with drought tolerance. There's another hormone called abscisic acid, which is responsible for, or one of the things it's involved in is stomatal regulation. Told you I can geek out on this stuff. Basically, when you have it upregulates the abscisic acid, it helps that tree be more efficient with its water. And so more roots, more efficient with the water. So it's something I'm playing around with, seeing some positive results from it compared to untreateds.
Yeah.
But I think that, again, with diseases, prevention is better than cure. And if you've got a tree that's covered up in these cankers, you might be looking at a replacement. I know my HOA ended up replacing, like all around it, they had Leylands and they got large. You know, the HOA is like 20 some odd years old. And so these trees were large. They took out a bunch and they've planted a bunch of new trees. And one of the trees I recommended was an Arizona cypress as they were replacing that and putting in something else for screening.